Hi, I've always loved painting flowers and I've got some beautiful roses in my garden and I want to show you how I would go about painting them in watercolour. Whether you are a total beginner or a more experienced artist, I hope you enjoy watching my process. Okay, let's do it. So let's have a look at the materials that I'm going to be using. First of all, I've got this really beautiful watercolour paper, which is 140 pounds in weight, or 300 GSM, which is a fairly standard rate and it won't wrinkle at all. I'm using watercolours from the tube because I like to squeeze them out onto the palette and then I can use them thickly or thinly. A variety of brushes, number 1 round, which I will be using mainly, then a larger one, a number 10. Oh my gosh, look, I'm struggling to hold the camera and pick up the brushes, but hey, I'm learning these skills. 2 jars of water because you want to keep your water as clean as possible, and some kitchen paper for blotting. I blot all the time. So here is my drawing. I like to use a reference photo on my iPad because you can zoom in and out and the colours are really true. So let's add some colours to our palette, and then what we're going to do is we're going to just start adding water and testing them out on a scrap piece of paper using lots of water, and see what kind of colour mixes we can create and how they match up with the photograph. This Indian red is actually quite browny, but I think it's going to be really useful for creating the shadow and the depth. So now let's tidy up our drawing. We want to make the pencil lines as light as possible because watercolour is so translucent and often pencil marks can show through. So we're going to start work on our very first petal, and what we're going to do is we're just going to paint a petal with water so the surface is nice and wet. Okay, so now we're going to take some wet paint and we're just going to drop it onto that wet surface, and you're going to see how it flows really beautifully. So this technique is called wet on wet. If you apply wet paint to dry paper, that's called wet on dry. I like this for the flowers because we can really get the nice bleeding of colours together, and it also creates a beautiful tide mark edge for the petal. Okay, so now I've got some pink, which I'm going to blend together with the red. What you'll find is the paint will literally stay just in that wet area. So we're going to build up the rose petal by petal as if it's a jigsaw. So now I'm actually just using water on my brush, and I'm going to sort of drag and bleed those colours together. So I've got darkness on the outer edges of the petal and lighter area towards the inside. And whilst it's wet, I'm going to go back over the edges, just add in a bit more definition. So next petal, wetting it again. So you can see in the light where the shine of the water is. And then we're going to again, make sure you have a lot of water on your brush and your paint is quite watery, so that when you drop it onto that wet surface it really bleeds out. Something you can practice with and learn over time is how much bleeding you want to achieve or not. So you can always practice on a spare piece of paper And also you can also layer the watercolors. So if you feel like you don't have enough depth of color, you can create a second layer. My technique is to let each petal dry before I paint next to it, because I don't want two petals to bleed together. So I want to paint each one individually. So it does look a little bit random to start with, and I'm sure some people might have a different technique where they want everything to blend together a little bit more, so to get more of a washy effect, but I'm a little obsessed with detail, so I like to just be really finicky and do it petal by petal. And what would be great for you is if you just experiment and try and find your own way of doing it that you find the most satisfying and rewarding. What I love about this rose, it's got flashes of yellow. So most of the petals are pink and then there's these areas of yellow. So actually that's really fun, integrating the yellow into the pink. And because we're using a very wet technique, they can easily blend together. On this larger petal, you can really see in full effect how I'm letting that dark pink and red bleed into the water. I actually really love the effect where it kind of stains. And because the surface is wet, you can actually work into it. You don't have to rush, you can work into it quite steadily. So do you remember I mentioned that I was using a colour called Indian Red, which is a very kind of dark brown red, like a maroon colour. And I'm using that as my shadowing, which you can see a little bit here. Especially if I layer the Indian Red and then I put the red over the top of it, and it gives nice kind of depth and shadowing. So don't ever try and use black to create your shadows because it really deadens the painting. But purple can be good, purples or brown. Just got to have a little experiment really, but I'm quite pleased with how the Indian Red has worked. So the benefit of drawing a nice large size rose is that you can really have a lot of fun with each petal. So I would recommend trying to be bold and go for a larger flower to paint rather than making it really tiny. You'll definitely need to move your paper into the light so that you can see where the water is. Actually, I've caught it really well there. That is just so satisfying, dropping that onto there. I think if you play around with this technique, you can really kind of free yourself up and discover a way of painting that you really enjoy. Always trying to remember that you're not trying to make it look like a photograph. It doesn't have to 100% represent total accuracy. Something that we always talk about in our art classes is artistic license, which I love. Artistic license means you're in charge, you know. You're doing the flower as you want to do it. Obviously mine looks fairly realistic, but you can see how you can be quite free with this technique and still create quite a realistic effect. And you might want to try something a little bit more abstracted or a bit more splashy. Just really have fun with it and see what happens. I love it when you add that detail onto the edge and it kind of bleeds out, and that will dry really nicely and you'll get like a nice crisp edge. Also, you'll probably find there's a point in the painting where you really just want to give up, and I would say persevere, just go with it. I promise you, you will be pleased that you did. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we are on the last petal, and then I've got that one tiny crease area up above to finish. This is going to be so satisfying to have actually finished this rose, and then you can step back and admire and then move on to rose number 2 if you are feeling brave. So let's see now. Okay, so that nice dark fold over the top. So this rose is virtually finished, and I just can't help myself. I'm adding some little details, just maybe building up a couple of areas around the edge, exaggerating a little bit some of the folds and some lines, and done. So the composition of my drawing is these two large flowers and a bud. I'm going to zoom through the painting of this second flower so you can just enjoy watching. I would probably recommend maybe just focus on one rose to start with before moving on to our sort of multi-flower composition, but entirely up to you. Okay, here we go. Isn't time-lapse amazing? It's just so satisfying to see that rose appear. And I am nearly done with this one. So now I'm going to move on to painting the small bud, which is going to be an absolute walk in the park after painting those two big roses. And then I will move on to the greenery. So for the stems and the leaves, I used Hooker's Green in dark, Sap Green. I also added in a bit of the cadmium yellow, and I used the Indian Red mixed with the Hooker's Green to create the really dark shadowed areas. So again, it's using that kind of nice warm tone to create darkness rather than black. So just coming back and finishing off that last petal of the rose, everything else is dry, so I can finally fill in that last gap. You can see that my palette is really a big mix of colours now. I've done a lot of colour mixing, which you can do a lot of mixing on the palette, and with watercolours you mainly do it on the paper, to be honest. So look here, I've got some yellow into the green, some pale green that I've just mixed white in. Just kind of drag all those colours together and a little highlight of white. I have basically mainly used this size 0 brush throughout the whole thing, but I'm a big fan of small brushes. So once I add in these extra 2 stems, the whole composition is really going to come together. So I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this tutorial, please do subscribe to my channel, and if you feel like it, add a message of a subject that you would like to see me cover. Just adding a few more tiny details to that leaf and the painting is complete. So I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much. Bye.